Welcome to the State of the Globe podcast from the Global Governance Institute in Brussels. My name is Joachim Koops, and in this podcast we examine core issues related to all things that matter in the realm of global challenges and global problem solving. Today it is our pleasure to sit down with Dr. Ronny Patz to examine the financial crisis, reform and future of the United Nations system at a time when the UN is under immense financial, political and geopolitical pressure. For more than 80 years, the UN has been the cornerstone of the global governance system, with far-reaching activities and impact in the fields of peace, security, development, humanitarian aid and much more. In fact, there is hardly an aspect of global governance and local impacts that is not affected in a direct or indirect way by the UN. However, 81 years after its creation, the organization faces an unprecedented perfect storm of challenges. The organization is facing a major liquidity crisis as a result of non-payment by core member states and the cutdown by many UN states of the budget. At the same time, the UN is under political attack from many member states, including, of course, the US administration, which has announced the withdrawal from more than 30 UN bodies. Where does this leave the UN and global governance? And are other countries, such as, for example, the Europeans or China, stepping up to fill the gap? And is the current UN reform process an effective attempt to address the various challenges the organization faces? To make sense of these questions and more, I'm glad to have with us today Dr. Ronny Patz. Ronny is an independent political scientist based in Germany and one of the foremost experts on UN finances. He has closely followed the ongoing budget negotiations in New York and has analyzed in comprehensive detail the implications for the UN and global governance in a wide range of public commentaries. Ronny, before we dive a bit more into the UN, also the reform process, the future, we have to focus on the financial crisis and liquidity crisis. You've, I think, researched this and analyzed this before it became popular and obvious to everyone that deals with the United Nations. So you've done quite a lot of research on the UN budget and so on. So could you give us a rundown of, let's say, the last 6 months that you also followed very, very carefully on how did we end up where we ended up in terms of why is the UN facing such a crisis? Why is that crisis maybe even more severe than previous financial crises? Because throughout the UN history, you always had, here and there, member states, even from the Security Council, withdrawing or threatening to withhold money. And how did we end up where we ended up? And why is this really a major critical juncture?
It's clear to say, as you said, that this is not the first crisis nor the first financial crisis of the UN system. But in a way, this crisis of 2025, or that started in last year in 2025, was maybe the largest and fastest hit to the entire system in a single moment that we probably have seen in the past 80 years of the history of the UN. So individual elements of what we see are not new, but all together at the same time, and I go into more detail in a second what this means, where the overall mass was what really drove this feeling of this is the worst crisis ever, in a sense. And the core driver obviously was the beginning of the Trump administration, the second one in early 2025. A lot of people were kind of prepared for the fact that when Trump comes to office again, he would cut down on UN funding. He would not be the strongest supporter. But I think even the most, let's say, negatively oriented commentators would not have expected the scale and speed of the downsizing of what he did. And obviously, when you look into the national decision-making of cutting down US aid, from everything to zero within a couple of weeks, you can understand that this is not just something that hit the UN system, but that also hit the US system. So at its core, we're talking about a US-induced crisis, but it comes at a moment when the overall global governance system is in a state of reorientation or lack of orientation. And so when the US decided to not fund the core UN budget, cut down its humanitarian and development aid massively to the UN system and beyond, there were very few actors stepping in at that moment to say, well, if they go out, we go in. And this was the moment that the Secretary General had to take, decisions in early 2025 on how to deal with the situation.
But it's not just the US administration, right, that has caused this, because I would assume, even though the US has been the biggest donor, has also paid the largest share of the assessments and the annual contributions, it would require more than just the US, even though this is a massive blow. It would require more than the US withdrawal for the situation to be as bad as it is right now. So what about the other countries?
I think what the US did is the difference between a UN system in cut down from a UN system in crisis, right? I think that's the thing that we should consider. A number of Western governments, in particular, who are the biggest donors to the UN system as a whole, across all domains of its work, peace, development, human rights, they were already cutting down on humanitarian and development budgets starting in 2024 and announcing it for 2025. So you can already see in the UN system in 2024 the first kind of preparations for a cut down, or let's say a more restrictive UN system with less lush funding. And it's important to understand that 2022 was the peak of the UN system funding in the last 1.5 decades in real and in nominal terms. What does it mean? At the tail end of all the money that went into the system from the COVID pandemic and the beginning of the Ukraine crisis and war, 2022 was kind of the year where all of this funding came together in 1 year. So there was a massive peak. So there was kind of some cut down that was expected because that was a very unusual year. But I think in 2024, it became clear that Germany, the UK, the Netherlands, Sweden's new government were all willing or all looking forward to cutting down UN funding, development funding. So this is not a pure US story. And what came on top of this, since 2025, China is the second largest contributor to the regular budget of the United Nations. And while the USA has a history of withholding funding to the UN system, and so the system was kind of not prepared, but at least adapted to this reality, the Chinese government has also decided in recent years to pay its annual shares to the budget instead of in one go at the beginning of the year, as it is legally obliged to, in different tranches, where the last big tranche in 2025 came only at the end of October. So $200 million of liquidity only were provided 2 months before the end of the year, which means that there is a series of crises of liquidity, of financing that come from very different governments and very different dynamics at the same time. But the underlying crisis cause is the US.
To try to understand in real numbers, what are we talking about here? I mean, are member states cutting down on their contributions to the UN because they're in economic decline and they need to save? I mean, are we, in terms of the GDP of each country, is this really such a big sum? Or are we talking here about ideological, strategic decisions to cut down the UN, so to also streamline it or even reduce its ability to fulfill its mandates? Or maybe it's a combination of both.
On the US side, it's definitely an ideologically driven cut down. The amounts we're talking about, at the peak, we were talking about 70 billion US dollars being in the UN system in 2022. The estimates for this year, 2026, are around 50 billion. So that's quite a substantive cut of 25% and more. All of these funding cuts, some of those are ideologically driven. Some of them are a reorientation in priorities. Governments in Europe focusing on military spending over humanitarian and development spending. Some of it is catering to right-wing voters in major donor countries who don't want international spending. And other parts are maybe a lack of credibility of the UN system in the last years, especially in this kind of geopolitical upheaval that we are in. Emmanuel Macron gave a speech to French ambassadors the other day saying that maybe now is the time to reinvest in the UN, as the US and in some regards China are withdrawing or questioning the system, which means that maybe some of those cuts also happened because the UN wasn't prioritized politically. And now political leaders have to restart thinking about, do we want to finance the UN? What kind of UN do we want to finance? And so there is kind of a temporal gap between the cuts and the political process that leads to a recalibration of what the real UN system will be and can be in the next 10 years or so.
It was quite quiet also on the European front when we were expecting Europeans to step up. And now is also the moment for maybe other countries to not only fill the gap of the US, but also really take up some leadership as well. Which countries do you see trying to turn this crisis maybe also into an opportunity?
The most visible actor in the last year has been China. And the latest development one could see in the New York sphere was the creation of a so-called group of friends of global governance that China created and led, and for the first time spoke in the name of this, 43 or so country group of global South African, some South American, some Asian countries being part of that group. And China spoke for the first time in the name of that group in one of the UN reform meetings in December. And Chinese media were very active at highlighting that this group was created. I think it builds on the Chinese government initiative on global governance that you could see last year. I'm not an expert on China, so I only observe this through my UN expert lenses. But it's quite interesting because in the UN system, you, for the last years, had kind of a balance between the so-called like-minded Western, EU, US, Japan, and other countries versus the G77, the Global South, and China. And there is now a kind of a dividing of those groups happening. On the Western northern side, the US becomes a separate kind of player. On the Global South side, you can see a division that goes beyond the typical kind of BRICS versus everyone divide, but it feels like the Global South in the UN is dividing between, the more human rights oriented and the more development oriented, the more democracy versus the more autocratic oriented groups. And I'm saying this in this long way because I think China seemed to be capitalizing on this gap of global governance initiatives. And I think they were trying to fill this out. I think Macron's speech indicates that some of the European leaders are waking up to this. But I haven't seen a concerted effort for, let's say, a new global governance, a new thinking of the UN. But it was really interesting in Macron's speech that he highlighted that some of the emerging powers are the losers, quote unquote, of the current UN governance, which indicates that Macron is willing to accept some of the losses of power that the global North has to accept in order to get to a new governance.
Maybe going to those negotiations, because you followed very closely all the diplomatic flurry and emergency sessions, and over the Christmas period, even last-minute negotiations between diplomats in New York, trying to somehow put together the budget and at least avert the bankruptcy or complete liquidity meltdown of the UN. It was also on the cards for some days, so it's not an exaggeration. So can you tell us a bit more about that? What has been achieved? What has been agreed on? And what does that mean moving forward for the UN? Are we in a situation where a major crisis averted, back to normal? Or are we, the worst case scenario has been averted or maybe just postponed? If we look at those outcomes and the year ahead, where are we essentially in this situation?
So for the listeners who are not following UN finances in much detail, at the end of 2025, the UN was finalizing negotiations on what's called the regular budget. So that's the annual budget that pays kind of the core operations of the UN. And here we're talking about around $3.5 billion out of the $50 billion of overall finances of the whole UN system, including all of the other areas like health and humanitarian aid and development. So just to start, that we're talking about the kind of core finances now of the UN. Indeed, this was really tough budget negotiations because after the US had initiated the crisis in early 2025, a few weeks later, Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the UN, announced that he would make proposals to cut down the UN budget by 15% more or less in cash resources and 18% in staff. So he was basically indicating to major donors and contributors that he was willing to make efforts to cut down the UN in the first place. And this was the biggest proposal for cuts, definitely since the 1980s, for formal cuts in the system. And it was not clear whether, especially the countries of the Global South, who profit from a lot of the funding that goes into the areas of development, humanitarian work, would be willing to accept those cuts going forward, or if the very complex compromises that need to be taken if you cut this amount of money would actually be found between the balance between human rights and development financing, for example. Usually UN budget negotiations finish by 24 December, a day earlier or two possibly. But this year, the formal adoption of the budget only happened on the 30th of December. So one day before the end of the year. If they hadn't adopted the budget by that time, the UN would have been bankrupt because the UN is not allowed to spend money without member states allowing it to spend money. And the budget is that kind of tool. They agreed on paper just 7 to 8% budget cuts. So for anybody who watches this from the outside might say, oh, the cuts were lower than what was actually proposed. But in reality, UN finances are complex, and there is a second decision hidden behind that budget figure that basically, I don't go into the details here, but basically means that in real money, the UN will only have $3.2 billion this year. So another 200 million less than the budget that was adopted. So this is basically in the ballpark figure where the Secretary General has proposed the cuts. Has it resolved the crisis? I'm not sure, because the crisis can still continue if the US does not pay its contributions in 2026, as it has not been doing for 2025 and 2024. So if the US pays, the crisis might be resolved. If not, we are going into another year of crisis now with even more cuts to staff and activities of the UN. And I think it would mean that we would spend another half year trying to resolve that situation, starting maybe in April or May this year.
Someone who is not maybe familiar with the workings of the UN system would also simply ask, how is that possible that a major member, founding member even, or any member of an organization cannot pay the long agreed on annual membership fee, as you mentioned it, so the annual contribution?
There is a very limited possibility to sanction the non-payment of membership fees, so-called assessed contributions, in the charter, the UN charter. And this is the loss of voting rights in the General Assembly if you haven't paid 2 years of your contributions, in summing up 2 years of worth of contributions. The issue with this is that even if the US would lose its voting rights in the General Assembly, it still has the right to participate in all meetings, make proposals for resolutions, have its veto in the Security Council. So let's say for a Donald Trump type government, losing one vote out of 193 in the General Assembly is not the stick that makes you pay that money. So in the past, what has worked and what works is the willingness of countries to pay comes from their conviction that the organization works alongside their interests, their priorities. And as long as the US does not see it this way, it will be very hard to push them to pay again into the UN system. And so we might enter a phase of a structural financial crisis, like a continuing ongoing financial crisis of the core UN system, for as long as a Trump type government is in office or a Trump type majority exists in the Congress that appropriates some of the spending for the US government. But forcing the US is impossible. At national level, when you think of you're not paying your taxes, there is actually a state with the power to force you to pay the taxes. But at global level, who would force the US to pay?
So and there we're back to the general problem of global governance without an executive authority able to implement it.
Can I add another element to this? Because looking at the EU, right, we could also think that why wouldn't major member states of the EU do similar things on the EU budget? But the interesting thing about the EU budget in comparison is that there is a redistribution of funding. So when the EU budget would not be adopted or not be financed, there are farmers, there are industries, there are scientists across the EU that would be affected, even in the major contributing states. While when the US cuts at funding, very few US citizens are affected by that. So there's also a lack of internal pressure, political pressure to do those payments.
Yes and no. I mean, not as directly probably as development aid and humanitarian aid, but if the entire system of governance collapses, also US citizens will feel that. I mean, just think about aviation security, think about telecommunication union, all these negotiations also on the internet.
Those UN agencies that deal with aviation, with AI and telecoms, this is where the US has actually said we continue to pay our contributions. This is exactly the kind of signal the US sends, right? Anything that seems vaguely technically relevant for them, we continue to finance. Anything that's politically unwanted, they don't want to finance.
And unwanted are also things like, for example, sustainable development goals.
Exactly. Climate change.
Women rights, climate change. Yeah, absolutely. Follow-up question also, because we do tend to over-focus on what the US does and doesn't do, and we seem to under-focus on what other countries do, and particularly now what the Europeans are doing, since they have been champions of, or self-declared champions of, multilateralism and global governance. Do you see a tendency, so in the first Trump administration, when there were already cuts to the development budgets, humanitarian aid, contributions to the UN, also voluntary contributions, we saw almost a parallel decision amongst European capitals, not necessarily right-wing or populist countries or governments, that then also quietly cut their contribution. So it always seems to be almost behind the US lane to then, when all the attention is on the US, to also do essentially more or less the same that the US is doing, rather than what you would expect, which is stepping up and filling the gap or going beyond. So we saw that during the first Trump administration. Is that also your impression for the situation right now?
I should highlight, and this is important for the first Trump administration, that over the past decade, the EU, meaning the EU budget itself, has developed into the largest contributor to the UN system behind the US and behind Germany in most years. So the EU budget is now around the third biggest contributor to the overall UN finances, which means that some of the retreat of European governments in the late 2010s, early 2020s was at least matched by an increase in EU finances. I think now we are in a stage where EU finances may have been maxed out for the UN system in a way, and the cuts that our governments are doing to humanitarian and development aid, they actually are a reduction of overall funding to the UN system. And I think that's the big difference between the first and the second Trump term. I also think that, at least on paper, the fiscal space, before the COVID pandemic was a bit more relaxed. So there was always a hope in the UN system at that time that major gaps could still be filled by lush funding that would be available in some corners of the budget of different nation states. Countries like Sweden were very pro-UN funding, and so were willing to jump in, because it's quite typical historically that since the 80s at least, that the US would cut gender-related funding, especially in UNFPA. So Netherlands and Sweden would jump in kind of regularly to fill those gaps. So in other words, I think in the first Trump term, there was still kind of more of a hope that those gaps would be, temporary and could be filled. I think those hopes are gone now. And you can see this in the formulation of Tom Fletcher, who leads the UN humanitarian operations from the Secretariat side. And he said that the UN system humanitarian side has entered into a phase of hyper prioritization, which means that they always had to prioritize because there was never enough funding for all humanitarian needs. But now they prioritize the needs first, and then they hyper prioritize what's actually available to save as many people from, dying from hunger as possible, knowing that they will not be able to save a significant amount with UN funding. And so the current situation looks much more bleak, and European governments, I live in Germany, I'm German. The German government is clearly not increasing its humanitarian funding. It's reorganizing its foreign ministry towards a more security-oriented way. There is a restructuring of the German development ministry announced. So we will see a lot of changes on our sides that look very different to the reality of 2019.
Yeah, some commentators also see a more sinister strategic reason behind weakening the UN system at the same time where, for example, also international law is being weakened, international humanitarian law. We see the situation between Russia and Ukraine. We see the situation in Gaza, where some observe, of course, a complete disregard for international humanitarian law. At the ICJ, there's the case now where it's going to be looked into whether a genocide is legally established. Of course, many commentators have already said it's beyond doubt that this has been taking place. And the UN, of course, was always a pillar of information, at least to the large extent objective information. Providing information is one of the role of international organizations. And we've also seen, of course, a lot of tensions between Israel and the United Nations system. And if you think about the US sanctioning the staff of the International Criminal Court. So there seems to be more than just a reprioritization of spending, more than just saying, well, there are certain woke policies that are not our national interest, but it seems to go even in some sense further, where there is a deliberate clearing of the field so that absolute power, military power, can be unleashed without any kind of guardrails. I mean, is that something you also see to a certain extent, or is that one step too far?
Well, I think individual governments may be doing that. I think they are not doing it to this extreme for the entire UN system, but maybe selectively for certain parts, because most member states, even the most powerful, are still parts of alliances of groups of states, that favor different parts of the UN system, that are not willing to let it die off completely. So in different words, even if China wanted to fully cut down all the human rights investigative work of the UN, it still wants to be in good partnership with Latin American countries that are very favorable overall of the human rights system. So I think there is a kind of pushback, but not yet a radical cutting down of major parts of the UN system. I mean, you can see that even the very UN critical Trump administration is willing to still adopt UN resolutions with missions in the Security Council, in Haiti, to some regards in Gaza, even if those missions are designed maybe less ambitious or less financially secure than in the past, but they are not saying no to everything. And even when you look into the US's cut lists that they have announced recently on what they don't want to support in the UN system, this still leaves open quite a bit of things that they don't cut down, even within the core work of the UN. So those are targeted cuts. I think there's also a lot going on outside the UN system, the development of informal forums, the creation of new international organizations. I don't know, the International Organization for Mediation that China has created, I think last year or the year before last year. There is a shift to international development banks because the UN system doesn't have enough funding. So there is discussion on, does the UN maybe provide more of the normative guidance, while the financing will happen through different global and regional development banks. So we are seeing a kind of, slowly disentangling of some of the global governance of the UN, but not yet a full-scale attack on everything going on.
The last point on the US, so the decision to withdraw from a list of 66 organizations, out of which there are also, I think, around 30 that are not UN entities. There are also European ones. There are entities on countering hybrid threats established by the Europeans. So there's a lot of things to entangle that goes beyond the UN. But of course, the headline-catching impact here was on the UN system. You already mentioned many of them smaller, not less important, but smaller ones that might be having a systemic effect. But, it's also a clear signal. Could there also be the argument that, well, maybe the UN system is better off without the US in some of those agencies? Maybe this is better now that there is clarity. It's better for the UN overall and for those that want to advance global governance, or is this another blow?
There are two answers to this. The first one is some of this withdrawing from those, 30-something entities is actually not very meaningful in a world where the US anyway doesn't pay for anything, right? So this withdrawal only matters at the moment when the US decides to pay again for everything else. On your question on, aren't we better off with the US being gone? I think no, for two reasons. No, because it means that for some of the issues, climate change is very obvious. If the US doesn't join, the global, let's not call it consensus, but at least a common purpose, then, all the efforts might be in vain, to govern that at all. And on top of that, I think some of the withdrawals on this long list of agencies that they don't want to support include, for example, UNDESA, the part of the UN Secretariat dealing with economic and social affairs, which is really important for China and for the global South, which means that a lot of the functioning of the UN system is based on complex compromises between, we finance your part of the system, but also our part of the system and vice versa. If the US withdraws from supporting global South Chinese supported areas, maybe the global South and China will have more pressure internally and externally to then defund other parts of the UN system that were important for the US and for the Europeans. And so this could be a kind of race to the bottom, this multilateralism a la carte, instead of a multilateralism that recognizes different interests, but more in the sense of equalizing those interests or finding a balance instead of just going to the lowest common denominator. And I think that's the biggest risk of what the Trump administration is doing there, push to a cut down UN with a core that's not really meaningful for many countries, governments around the world. And I think going back to the earlier part of our conversation, I think the fact that somebody like Macron reacts to this now shows that there is a fear that this is happening, right? And the way he framed these things in his speech indicates that that's a real concern by now by some leaders.
So moving to what the UN itself is doing or its systems, so of course there's also been a parallel reform process. Partially this has been framed as an efficiency exercise, even though there have been doubts about whether what is happening right now is A, leading to efficiency, B, whether the UN can be even more efficient. If you compare budgets of similar size and activities of other organizations, you sometimes do wonder. I mean, by and large, I think there's agreement by many international observers and analysts that the UN is already doing quite a lot with comparatively small budget. But nevertheless, there is a reform process now that the Secretary General initiated, UN 80, that runs in parallel. And maybe also there is the hope partially to address the financial crisis of the UN. You followed this closely as well. What is your assessment of that process?
The UN80 process is kind of a mix between a reaction to what happened in 2025 with the US cuts and a realization that something needs to be done. But it also started earlier because I think there were pushes from major donors and key governments in 2024 that the UN system should look into efficiencies and cutting down corners that were considered not cost efficient, cost effective enough. This UN80 process is basically organized in three broad streams. The first stream is really finding simple efficiencies, especially within the secretariat, and this cut down budget that we have seen at the end of 2025, the irregular budget, is kind of the first key element of that first work stream, as it's called. The second work stream is about thinking, is the UN having too many mandates, stuff to do on writing reports, on having meetings, on having annual resolutions that need to be adopted again and again, that are superfluous, doing things that are outdated for 20 years but are still ongoing. And so member states on this work stream too sit together in a working group to discuss how to change the decision making in especially the UN General Assembly in order to prevent outdated mandates to be continued unnecessarily. And the third work stream is really the one that's in a way most ambitious, but also most hard to achieve. And that's thinking about whether the UN system as a whole, with its 40 plus entities and agencies, could be restructured. Things that are overlapping, can they be merged? Can they be combined? Can they have shared services? And all of these three streams were initiated in March 2025 by the Secretary General and then evolved in different forums, in different speeds. All of this went very fast. If you think of typical reform processes in the UN system, you would rather think of it in 2-3 year cycles. Yeah. And all of this here was very fast. And it happened at the time of these big budget cuts we just talked about before, which makes it really hard to disentangle what are kind of reform steps and what are cutback management steps. And that made it very hard for a lot of people who followed the reforms, but also who were part of them, to decide whether what's happening is good or bad, necessary or unnecessary, because some things that didn't make sense from a reform perspective made sense from a financial perspective. One example, a lot of the budget cuts that were agreed at the end of 2025 for the regular budget, they are on staff costs. And you could have said, maybe we reorganize the UN Secretariat and think more strategically of where staff should work. But in reality, a lot of those staff cuts were actually just by whoever's contract ended. Those positions were more likely to be cut because they were anyway empty, so not to hurt anybody. So you had kind of a mix of a reform and a attrition process. So in short, and we can go into more detail if you want, I think this reform process was very fast in three very different streams with kind of an overlap between difficult funding situation and the impetus to reform. And I hear from a couple of people and also read in some sources that the Secretary General Guterres wants to leave a legacy and that UN80 process is kind of his legacy. So I think he's pushing also some things faster than maybe they would need to go because his mandate will end this year. We are already in the process of selecting a new Secretary General. So some of these things are quite fast, although they could take more time.
If we talk about UN reform, we think about big ticket topics, right? We talk about how does the UN get ready for essentially a different world, certainly a different world from 45 and also a different world from 10 years ago. So it's really about massive changes and adaptation from the reform of the Security Council all the way to what should be the key priorities, how do you deliver for all of the new developments and challenges, and how do you make tools like UN peace operations, or also how to deal with the global impact of artificial intelligence and all of these kind of things. None of that seems to be anywhere near a discussion of the current UN80 reform process, if, when I follow you also correctly, is mostly a cost-saving exercise, left, right, and center, that's not even coordinated, and where I also see not a lot of discussion or involvement of a broad base of staff. It seems to be a very small group of UN top leaders that are deciding on this, and secondly, not massive deliberative input from member states, and certainly not a public debate.
No, the UN80 process is a very bureaucratic, at best diplomatic process, and the reason for this is that at the time that the Secretary General initiated this process, I think the majority of member states, especially at leadership level, hadn't even processed what was going on, while as a Secretary General, he knew what was coming into the UN system. So he started the process, but member states in the General Assembly took until July, so from March to July, before adopting even the first resolution to say that they in general endorse this process as a whole, without being very specific on anything, which meant that it took 3-4 months even before member states were ready to engage politically with this process. The big problem is that many of the really big reforms, the one you were talking about, the kind of geopolitical reforms, the Security Council and global governance as a whole, they really require the highest level engagement, heads of state and government, to make sense at all. But even a lot of the administrative reforms that the Secretary General initiated in March 25, they need the agreement of very different intergovernmental bodies, because each UN agency and entity, they have their own legal status, their own governing boards, their own assemblies. So even if the Secretary General says we should cut down the number of entities of the UN system, that involves 193 member states, not just in the General Assembly to agree on this, but maybe also 190 something member states in WHO to agree on this, and the major donors in the board of the World Food Programme to agree on this. And because he did not focus on building a political coalition for this first, what happened in reality is there was a development of ideas from inside the UN system. And obviously each agency, each corner of the system wants to defend their own turf. And so any radical proposal was already cut down to the minimum possible, even before member states started to engage with this. When you look into the discussions in the so-called ad hoc informal working group that deals with the mandate life cycle of how member states decide on UN work, I think they started with very engaging, positive discussions in autumn. But I've seen the draft resolution published in early January, and it's very status quo oriented. There are a few improvements, but this is just a draft, and that's before member states have negotiated it. So even the biggest improvements in there might be watered down further. So let's be very clear. The UN80 process, as you said, is dealing with a cut down process because less money is available, and that's really necessary, but it's not the process that leads to the big reform. And I think, let's say in a positive spirit, right, one would say that if there are some reform steps achieved by the autumn of 2026, a new Secretary General that will be elected by the end of the year or in late autumn, she or he, likely he, but everybody hopes for a she, might start from a different level to initiate, let's say, more political or geopolitical reforms, while maybe not having to do a lot of the housekeeping, because UN80 is a lot of housekeeping of a blossoming system that has grown over the years.
Yeah, a lot of energy being put on it, and also leading to a lot of anxiety, chaos, infighting. So this is also, it's additionally weakening the entire organization that should really be ideally focusing on how to now survive and deliver. But now it seems to be also turning inwards a lot because, of course, everyone tries to more or less figure out what these cuts mean and how to maybe avert them also for their own personal situation, which is completely understandable. So rather unhelpful. And just one comment from the scholarship on international organization effectiveness, this entire discussion about duplication of mandates, I think we've seen this even in Europe when it was about Council of Europe and European Union and OSCE and all these overlapping mandates. And the proposal is always the same. Shouldn't there be consolidation? It's unrealistic. And it also seems to, in many ways, be a little bit of a red herring. Because I don't think, and I think everyone would agree that the UN budget and what needs to be achieved with it is really not the issue here, or efficiency is not the issue. It really is about adaptation and making it fit for the challenges ahead and making sure member states actually deliver on what they promise, expect, and what they owe.
I think still, if you cut the overall funding of the overall UN system from 70 billion to 50 billion or even less, you have the choice to either cut down on duplicate efforts or to prioritize within the existing organizations, because you just don't have the money to do everything in the same way as before. And both of these, reducing duplication or prioritizing within the structures, are hard political compromises or processes that need to be done.
Okay, well, yeah, last question, I know is a big one, but I would nevertheless be interested to hear your view on this, and that's where are we going in terms of the future of the UN and maybe even global governance more broadly? What's your assessment here in terms of key developments, not only in 2026, but looking ahead? And what's also maybe a question that where we break it down again from the high political level of what member states and what heads of states need to do. If we want a global governance that works or a UN that works, what can the ordinary citizen do?
The trend of further fragmentation of the global governance system within the UN and outside of it will continue, because at the moment, I don't see a kind of collective core of key leaders in the world, nor key groups of countries that are really having a joint idea of what a less fragmented, more common core of the UN system will be. Maybe we are moving to something that Donald Trump pushes, at least on paper or in his words, focus more on peace and security and less on all the other elements in the UN system, although his actions, speak maybe against that voices. But I think the citizens of the world, whether they live in democracies or autocracies, right, they have an interest that this global system doesn't break down completely, because it has been an infrastructure as problematic, and as weak in some regards as it has been, but it has been there to resolve not all of the conflicts, but some of them, not solve all of the global issues, but at least help to address some of them, make us realize what are really common global problems and which ones maybe we just solve within our nation states, however they are governed. And so I think all of the citizens of the world, they can signal to their governments that it's worth fighting for a functioning system at global level. With one difficulty, it also means accepting that you are not always right or not always winning. If you are 193 countries, if you want to be always right on everything, it means everybody has a veto, which means nothing gets done. And I think that's the hardest thing for us to accept as citizens, that sometimes you can see it on issues such as Gaza and Israel, right? The hard-fought debate on both sides or all sides of this issue means that whatever the UN does, somebody will not be happy with it. But at least it's a forum where these things are discussed, not just, between one or two leaders, but between 193 leaders. And maybe we sometimes find the fine line that the least amount of people are the least unhappy about the state of the world, instead of everybody being maximally unhappy about everything.
Right. And concretely, I get this question also very often from students, when the analysis of the UN system and the way forward is being discussed, and the student raises his or her hand and says, okay, and what can I concretely do if I want this system to work better?
I mean, in many countries of the world, there are UN associations that you can join and try to support it. I think signaling to your, if you live in a democracy, signaling to your parliamentarians that you care, that you are unhappy about funding cuts to the UN system will be important, because maybe, your local deputy or your favorite party deputy, they get a lot of emails, phone calls on national taxes, but they don't get a lot of emails on UN funding or UN work. And maybe one or two emails more may make them realize that this matters. But I also think that staying in touch with people across borders is important, including in countries, where our leaders might disagree, but showing that the UN is not just an intergovernmental system, but that it's based on actual understanding that we are citizens of the world with all its difficulties is really important, because it means that even if our leaders fight and disagree within UN forums, we know, and maybe we let them know, that we are still in touch with our peers in the countries that are fighting. And take anybody who is in contact with Iran right now, right? I mean, our governments are clearly not cooperating with Iran, but maybe by being in touch with the citizens of Iran, we are showing that we feel we are a common world, and that's important still.
Right. Ronny, thank you so much for this conversation, but also, of course, for all the excellent work you're doing on this. Big public service, I think, to many. And also looking forward to your forthcoming analysis for GGI that will examine all of these issues in greater detail. But at this stage, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the State of the Globe podcast. For more information and analysis, visit globalgovernance.eu. Until next time.